Thank you for joining us for our online webinar today to talk about disinformation, COVID-19, and what higher education needs to know. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and I am the director of the Campus Free Speech Program, working on issues of free speech in a broad sense, and diversity and inclusion at colleges and universities across the country. I'm joined today by a panel of distinguished speakers from different arenas: higher education, free speech advocacy, and investigative journalism. Quickly, I'll just introduce our three speakers, and then we're going to get right into the conversation. We have Brandy Zadrozny, who is a librarian turned award-winning investigative journalist who works with NBC News, investigating issues of disinformation, extremism, and the internet. We're joined by Filippo Menzer, who is Distinguished Professor of Informatics and Computer Science at Indiana University and Director of the Observatory on Social Media. I won't try to summarize your research, Phil, right now, since I'm sure you can do a better job than I can. And third, my colleague from PEN America, Nora Benevidez, who directs our free expression programs across the US, working to fight against threats to journalists, freedom of the press, and general citizens' rights across the board in the First Amendment. So thank you all for joining us today. The structure, just a quick note on that, is we're going to try and keep this conversational. I have some questions that we've planned out with each of the panelists. And for those of you watching, please feel free to put any questions that you'd like us to take up in the Q&A box at the bottom. We're going to try and hold most questions until the end, but if it's relevant to the conversation, then I will be moderating and I will be bringing those questions into the conversation. And with that, really, it's just wonderful to be here discussing this fascinating topic with you all, about which I have to say I am no expert, and I'm here really to serve, to learn from all of you and be educated about this complex topic that I'm hearing about everywhere I turn: disinformation, misinformation, challenges of just how COVID is disrupting what it is we think we know about the world and about society. So I want to start just by trying to define the problem with you, Brandy. I know you have a lot of experience covering disinformation. Do you think you could start by telling us a little bit about what you're working on now and what kinds of trends you're seeing? Oh, you're on mute.
Technology reporter. So you can hear me, yes? Great. So I'm working on coronavirus with literally every other reporter in the world. And my experience as a reporter generally has been mostly to look at the extreme corners of the internet. For a long time, that was, the anti-vaccination movement, the alt-right, incels, men's rights movements, militia movements, white supremacists, stuff like that. And as a group, I've always sort of just had my sights set on grifters. I find them fascinating. Alex Jones, conspiracy theorist who really just sells supplements. Guy in California, this guy Larry Cook, who runs the largest anti-vaccination campaign. He is a supplement seller, evangelicals selling colloidal silver, that type of group. And I've been looking at this sort of broad group since 2013, sort of the weird fringe internet group. And around 2016, it became really important somehow because the groups that used to be really on the fringe suddenly became more vocal and a lot more powerful. A lot to do with the way that the platforms were built, right? And they were built to sort of amplify shocking content that was fast and cheap and lacked expertise. So then came coronavirus, right? And suddenly, I've been describing it as this sort of boss level, like the folks that I've been watching for years, the anti-vaxxers, the hucksters, the conspiracy theorists, they've all got a common goal now. And that goal is to really, at its base level, undermine trust in medical doctors, public health experts, and politicians who are sort of implementing guidelines that they say will stop the spread of coronavirus. So now these groups have sort of come together in a way that isn't necessarily surprising, but shocking, right? So you look at the example of the anti-quarantine state protests, and what we're seeing is that they're being organized on Facebook by really extreme political groups, but also anti-vaccination organizations, Second Amendment right groups, militia groups, and also some groups that follow this Boogaloo movement, which is basically a sedition movement that wants a second civil war. So all the groups that I used to report on have now all come together in furtherance of this common goal. And those groups are now have found some legitimacy, thanks in part to a media who's covered the protests uncritically, and thanks in part to a scary pandemic where everybody's forced inside and everybody's looking for answers. And I'm a trained librarian, and when I want to find an answer, like what is happening in my community, how does this affect me, it's hard online. It's hard to find good information. So that's sort of what we're looking at. In terms of trends, I think the first round of misinformation that we saw was really from these hucksters, right? The supplement sellers, the people that said, vitamin C and UV light and whatever will cure you. And that's what we saw at first, which makes sense. But then what we're now seeing is the anti-quarantine groups coming together, and they're arguing that the country should be reopened immediately. And underlying that opinion were several conspiracies, and they range from, the conspiracy that the coronavirus is this hoax, that it's a Chinese weapon, that it's a democratic plot to make Trump lose, or that it's a sort of manufactured crisis by people who allegedly stand to profit, like Bill Gates and other sort of boogeymen. And because we're nowhere near a vaccine, you're going to see, I think, and experts that I talk to think, that's the sort of thread of misinformation that we are following now and that we're going to see for a long time. And that's the sort of thing that we saw with the pandemic, and we expect to see going forward.
Well, I'm going to come back to pandemic a little bit later on. I want to save it for now. But for me as just general citizen, I think I've always had a sense that there were some of the fringes that you're describing, folks on the internet trying to peddle misinformation, hucksters. I'm trying to get a sense of if that always existed, why is it so urgent now? What's gotten worse? And Nora, I know you've been talking about it at Penn, your work on media literacy for the past year, and I've kind of been around a lot of that, but not deeply engaged in it. I'm wondering if you could just help us to understand, what are these different terms: misinformation, disinformation, malinformation? Why is this, so concerning for us? Why does it matter?
Well, luckily, Brandy went first and didn't unmute herself. So I was like, I have to unmute myself. It's great to be here, you guys. This is my favorite topic nowadays. So, I will say PEN America's been looking at the problem, let's just say the larger issues around truth and the internet for several years. And frankly, it was, I think back to when we started looking at this, not at all the sort of level that Phil has been researching this. We're really looking writ large at what the larger sort of disinformation phenomenon is doing to society. And we started looking at that in 2017 to examine essentially what was the effect in 2016, and the role that information is playing when people begin to lose trust in our institutions. What does that do to elections? What does it do to democracy? And it's funny, I think back to that period, we were still, as an organization, referring to the term fake news. And I just think, I know, it's like, ooh, you wince at it. Our first report on this was called Faking News. And we really looked at what we called fraudulent news at the time. And then over the years, we've continued examining the effect, for example, of dis and misinformation on the midterm elections in 2018. And what's so interesting is that, the terms evolve quickly, as do tactics. And almost none of the larger sort of societal analysis can even keep up. And what we found is much of what Brandy sort of began to prelude, which is that really there are large scale and what I think of as almost slow simmering campaigns to sow discord in society. And that's one large overarching umbrella that informs and sort of motivates our work in our media literacy space, where what we try to do is empower communities to feel like we're all online users. We could all even think of ourselves as publishers in a way, that we have the power to think about posting or not posting. And what does that do to becoming more sort of informed and healthy practitioners online? But I think that in the COVID context, there has been not just a, deluge of disinformation. There's honestly just a deluge of information. And one of the problems has been sorting through and thinking about all of us, if we're online more, how do we make sense of what we're seeing? So some really basic distinctions, because John hears me regularly talk about all of these terms. And frankly now, I don't know about you, but for the other experts, every posting now I do, I never know, should I call it mis or disinformation? And I usually now just say mis dis with a hyphen or something, because I think that the general public actually is not aware of the distinctions, and it doesn't quite matter for early introductions to the issue. Misinformation is mistaken information that is incorrect. A lot of times it is due to reporting errors or just people sharing things with no ill intent. Disinformation is really grounded in the intent behind the way information has been created or weaponized to make some kind of harm towards communities, whether it's large societal or unique, let's say your political candidate opponent. So disinformation is really kind of has this harder edge to it, because we think about that it's been created with the intent to deceive and harm people. And then malinformation, I checked before today because I talk about malinformation a lot, and no one has a consistent definition nowadays. But I have slowly been thinking about the prevalence, and it's sort of the last thing I'll say here in the intro, is thinking about what we're seeing in the COVID context. And so much of what we're seeing is different than what we think about in the larger political or election related realm. And the way that information has been appropriated, and frankly, images and videos are being used that are actual existing images or videos, but they are made to sort of help people think that they're from somewhere else. So they are misattributed perhaps, or given a context that is incorrect. And so it's malinformation in a way because it makes you believe, and it leads an audience to believe a certain different thing. Often the definition, just from sort of like a harder definitive standpoint, is really linked to the effort to change and motivate people's beliefs. And so all of these together, I would say, if by the end of today you don't remember all of the distinctions, that's probably fine. But the large overarching, thing that I think unites all of this is that we are absolutely not going to see this going away. The internet isn't going anywhere. The way that information, news especially, is now weaponized and used to make people question what they see and also question institutions leads us to, frankly, then have breakdowns in engagement with each other and with our institutions.
I've been trying to think about some key instances in my own head and place them into the typology. And I see what you mean about, not everything easily fitting. I think of President Trump drawing on the weather map some time ago. And, is it disinformation? Is it willful intent to disinform? Is it just kind of misinformation? It's hard to know always, I think, where the intent lines and draw distinctions in different kinds of intent. But I think that's what strikes me so interesting here, because both Brandy and Nora, you're talking about slow simmering campaigns, hucksters, people that are, trying to kind of sow discord, sow distrust. And, maybe there's just fundamental misconceptions because, I'm not friends with those people. I don't, think that anything that they're circulating on the internet, really crosses across my mind or my phone day to day. And yet, what you're saying is suggesting that maybe my fundamental ideas about the realms in which those groups are trying to operate are much bigger than I once realized. So I'm going to turn to you, Phil, to kind of walk us through some of that here, because I know you've been a leading researcher on this issue for many years. How do we think about the internet and thinking about, vulnerability of online users, and how even I might, come to realize that actually most of the information I've read in the past 24 hours might not be truth?
Well, thank you. That's a big question, and hi everybody. So a lot of what Brandy and Nora said really resonates, and it goes to the vulnerability. Like, why are we now becoming the target of all of these different conspiracy theories that are somehow merging, and new information or new uncertainty pushes any piece of information to falls into different narratives that are evolving and gets politicized and so on. and what is the role of the fact that we exchange a lot of this information online through platforms that have their own mechanisms, they have their own biases, they expose us to a lot of information. So what Nora was saying about the deluge, that's also one of the vulnerabilities. So the work that we do in our lab is tries to do some quantitative analysis at measuring, visualizing, quantifying the spread of information and misinformation. And I'll use this term very generically to include sort of all categories there. Because very often, of course, as Nora was saying, these things mix together. Maybe something starts as disinformation, but then people spread it unknowingly, so it's misinformation. Other times people share misinformation just because of ignorance or confusion, and then other people latch onto that and build narratives and to co-opt people, so it becomes disinformation. So these things are you know, there's not a clear demarcation line. If you don't mind, I'm gonna share my screen to use a few visual aids to share what we do in our lab to characterize the different kinds of vulnerabilities that to this kind of manipulation online. So let me see if I can do that. Okay. I hope you can see my slides. So we often try to quantify these effects from a network perspective, because all of our interactions that happen online are basically a network where you know, the people that we are friends with, the people that expose us to information, when we share information, who sees it, all of that can be modeled mathematically as a network. So here's an example of the kind of networks that we study. This shows the spreading of one particular piece of misinformation, or actually we should call it disinformation, that was very popular during the 2016 elections, this claim that the Clinton campaign was involved in satanic rituals. And it was one of the most viral pieces of disinformation that was spreading on Twitter, for example. And so in a network like this, a node represents a Twitter user, and a connection between two nodes represents how this particular piece of information, this particular article, moved from one person to another. For example, through a retweet, right? If Nora posts something and I retweet it, then that means that I have seen what Nora has seen. And then Brandy retweets that, and so then we now have a chain, and we could see things spreading virally, as in this particular case where a lot of users were exposed to it. When we look at these networks, we can look at what is the role of influential accounts. So these are these large nodes with lots and lots of connections because they have many followers. Very often these are either celebrities or the sources of a piece of misinformation, or accounts that are working together with those sources. So in this particular case, that would be the InfoWars account and the Alex Jones account, for example. But another thing that you see in this network, if you look at the colors of the nodes, you'll see that some nodes are colored in red. Those are nodes that, according to our algorithms, are likely to be automated, or what we call social bots. And so you can see that there is a lot of these social bots that play an important role in amplifying the spread. So the way in which many people are exposed to a particular piece of misinformation may be through accounts that, unbeknownst to them, are inauthentic. So I'm gonna come back to this later. But just to say a little bit more about vulnerabilities, right? So this plot just shows that you know, it is not unlikely to find a piece of misinformation that spreads very virally as much as information from reliable sources. So this is a sort of an experimental observation. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, we try to understand what are the factors that help explain this kind of a dynamics. Why is it that misinformation can spread virally? And so we build models, different kinds of models, but for example, agent-based models where we simulate a social network and how information spreads on this network, mimicking the rules of a social media platform like Twitter or Instagram. And so with these models, one of the things that we learned is that because of the structure of the social network, because our social networks are very clustered, and because there are big hubs, and sort of other structural characteristics of these networks. And because we have limited attention, we are not able to process everything in our feed before we decide what to reshare. We just look at a few things, right? This again connects back to the deluge of information Nora was talking about. With those two ingredients, we expect that some things will go viral even if there is no value in them. It's kind of inevitable. So when you look at that curve that I showed you earlier, this is basically inevitable, even if you assume that the stuff that is spreading is completely random and people choose at random. So now what happens if people do prefer to select good quality information? So we can build a model in which people are more likely to share things that are high quality in their feed and less likely to share things that are low quality. Then what happens? Are the best ideas going to win? Is it more likely that high quality information spreads virally? Well, that depends. So in this model, we have two parameters. One is the attention of the users. How likely it is that you're going to look at several things in your feed before sharing something. It's on the y-axis of this density plot. And on the x-axis is like, how much information do I receive from all of my friends? It's information load. What you observe is that when the attention is high or the information is low, there is a high correlation between quality and popularity. So in that network on the left, those big nodes, that means that a lot of the memes that are spreading are high quality. But when the information load is high or the attention of the individuals is low, where we are hurried, we only look at a few things, most of the stuff that spreads is low quality. That's what we see in the right, in that network at the top right, where a lot of nodes are small. That means low quality memes that are spreading. So even in an environment where we know how to discern between high quality and low quality, and we prefer to share high quality information, inevitably, because we're overwhelmed, because of information overload, a lot of low quality information will share. So this is a vulnerability that's created by the fact that on our platforms, we have so many connections and we get so much information. Another vulnerability comes from the fact that the platforms, they have to figure out how to prioritize things because we can only see a portion of them. So they often rely on engagement or popularity. So if something is shared by a lot of people, the platform assumes that there's something good about it and they're more likely to share it to us. So we build models in which we looked at the effect of this kind of popularity or engagement bias on the average quality in the system. So what this plot shows you is that the more a platform relies on engagement signals, the more it's likely that low quality information will go viral and the lower average quality in the system. There is some exceptions, like there is a narrow yellow band in the middle of that plot. That's the case in which, under the right circumstances, which are quite narrow, a little bit of emphasis on popularity may help the platform recognize what's good quality. But generally speaking, that's not the case. So the fact that platforms have to use engagement in their ranking algorithms actually contributes to lowering the quality of the information that we are exposed to. And then this assumes that this is just the platform deciding what we see, okay? We play no role. However, when you look at stuff on your Twitter feed or Facebook feed or Instagram feed, it always tells you 50 people shared this, 100 people liked this, right? 200 comments and so on. So these engagement metrics are always shown to us. So we used an app called Fakey that we developed in the lab. It's a news literacy app that simulates a feed like what you would see on Facebook or Twitter, where you have to decide whether something is reliable, you want to share it or like it, or it's suspicious, you want to fact check it, based on the information that you would see on an actual feed, like the picture, the headline, and a short description. And in this, we ran an experiment where we kind of played with those numbers, right? The engagement numbers. And what this shows is that exposure of these engagement metrics make people more vulnerable, okay? So the more people think that a particular article is high engagement, we tell them that 1,000 or 100,000 people share it, the more they're likely to share it, even if it's a piece of misinformation, if it's fake news, or information from a low credibility source. And the more, again, those engagement metrics are high, the less people are likely to fact check it. Again, this is for information from low credibility articles. So even just the mere exposure to these engagement metrics make us vulnerable. So it's like a double whammy, right? On one hand, the platform uses those metrics, and that can trick things, can amplify low quality stuff. On the other hand, we believe those metrics and we may be tricked. And then on top of that, of course, those metrics can be gamed, right? You can create fake accounts that creates the appearance of many people sharing something. And that way you can trick both the platforms and the users. So I'm gonna stop here and I'll come back later to, perhaps we can talk more about literacy and about bots. But I just wanted to give an overview of some ways in which, just the fact that we access news and information from these networks makes us vulnerable in some ways.
Well, I mean, it's just incredible to see it laid out this way and to think about it, and to consider just this notion how sophisticated that is. That when I see something that has been liked 1,000 times, that 900 of them, or at least maybe half, aren't real people and aren't, and that the news itself isn't real. I'm also struck by the challenges in the way that the internet deals with kind of humor and sarcasm. So like if I find something online and it amuses me, whether I think it's true or not, I might, repost it to other people. And I'm not really necessarily telling you how to interpret it. This is fake, but it's hilarious. I'm just passing it on in that sense. And so, I mean, in your coverage, Brandy, when you're thinking about, how this kind of fringe groups have gained a foothold, I mean, is it your sense that most people, when they are spreading misinformation, are doing it without realizing that that's what they're doing? Like, do you think that most people are conscientious of any of this, or it's just like, people are, I think the narrative has been, people just don't understand how much there is out there, and they don't really understand what they're doing, and they kind of just believe anything they read. Is this about, an argument for better training and critical thinking?
Well, always. But I think there are two questions there. One is, when we think about, what Phil was talking about in terms of, likes and shares, and when we look at some trending topics on Twitter, whether it's, people calling Elizabeth Warren a snake or whatever, often the most tweets about this thing are actually from people trying to say no, saying the alternate opinion, that she's not a snake and here's why. And so the conversation gets these narratives trending, which if you really look into the actual conversation, it's people saying no. But then the problem is people like me in the media who say, oh, this is trending now. And then they write things about how Elizabeth Warren somehow is a snake and somehow, did Bernie Sanders wrong, which only furthers the misinformation that the election is rigged, right? So there's a whole host of people that did the wrong thing there. But when we talk about like people mistakenly spreading misinformation, especially this is prevalent now, because when you look at people who spread health misinformation, the motivation behind that is almost always altruistic, right? It's almost always people saying, this might help you. Vitamin C might cure you. They're looking to spread things that they think will help their friends and family members. And some people you'll even see in comments will be like, I don't know how true this is. And even in personal conversations, but check it out, right? And so that spreads it too. And no, a lot of these people probably don't understand that the people selling the actual vitamin C supplements are, conspiracy theorists. And I think that does, it does speak to the very important need that Nora was saying, that every single person thinks of themselves as a content producer, and every share that they take part in is a part of like a digital democracy, right? That we are all citizens and people who contribute to the health of that democracy. So yes, very much so. And I think if there's any power to change anything in terms of misinformation and disinformation, it starts with the consumer, the individuals, knowing what they're sharing and being skeptical of the ideas that they're propelling, even if they don't mean to.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the most recent one, which already came up, Plandemic. I mean, that one came to me first as exactly as you're describing, as an example of the media saying, don't watch this. And I wonder to what extent it's like, you know, the parent telling the kid not to put their finger in the electric socket. You know, it's like, well, that, of course, now I'm going to do that thing now that you've told me not to. I mean, and I've seen a lot of engagement just in personal networks where people watched it, you know, and they know, they kind of intuitively know that some parts of it must be exaggerated or untrue, but then they're kind of looking for the kernels of truth in it. I'm just wondering, Nora, like, what's your take on Plandemic? You know, why has this gone so viral, and you know, is there a way that the media or that individuals could be better trained to receive this kind of thing?
Sure. Well, Plandemic has a lot of tentacles to talk about. I avoided watching it for about a week. Once I saw people beginning to slowly bubble up in my news feeds talking about it, my hope was, naive and ignorant as it was, that it would go away. And of course I knew it wouldn't, but you know, I think what's interesting, at least from the outset when you start watching it, and I should sort of summarize for those that maybe haven't actually seen it, it is a snippet. I think it's 25 plus, like 25 and change minutes, snippet of a larger documentary. And, you know, it sort of focuses on this one protagonist woman, if you will, who is a doctor and scientist going on what seems to be a pretty credible, almost like emotional, really pulling on your heartstrings narrative of how she has been targeted for trying to unearth truth, which is brilliant, frankly, emotionally, that this protagonist is so moving, and that she's been put in jail just in the first 3 minutes of this documentary, that she's been jailed, her research has been suppressed, and sort of she's been targeted by leading scientists who are now leading authorities on coronavirus. And so what's interesting is that in many ways, I think the larger overarching theme is that it seeks to discredit credible information and science, is one sort of overarching theme. But what's interesting regarding what you asked is that I think the documentary starts with what a lot of disinformation has, and why disinformation is so compelling for us. It does have this patina of credibility. It has something in it where when you start, maybe you start reading a headline, or you start the Plandemic, you know, something feels authentic about it. You want to believe what it is you're seeing. And it's really our human behavior then that we buy into that. And if we're thinking through why disinformation is so urgent and why the threat is so real, I think that's one question. Certainly then the spread of Plandemic and the platform responses are another couple of the tentacles that we could discuss. But that early question of, you know, what is Plandemic? Why is it so palpable for us when we see it and we want to respond? I think it's because it plays on our emotions. And it is an incredibly incendiary topic during a very confusing period of our lives, where potentially the notion that someone has unearthed truth and is this whistleblower on science, really lending credence to her own credibility, is something that people respond to. And I think we could all see ourselves responding to it. So it's very much our human nature. And what's interesting is, how do you then think about ways to arm yourself as a consumer and as an online user, arm yourself to think twice without becoming simply a knee-jerk critic of everything? But how do we become more discerning and think through, why am I seeing this? Is there a kernel of truth that is leading me then to believe what I'm being told? And in thinking that through, you know, we sort of have a host of toolkit resources at PEN America for online users. And a lot of what we work on now is working directly with communities and with people who, in the middle of the pandemic, are worried about how they can verify information, as well as then the longer term, as we've all talked about, sort of those slow simmering political campaigns. And all of it together, I think, presents various threats. One is there's the immediate threat that someone could believe what they hear in Plandemic, which is Dr. Mikovits says, for example, if you wear your mask, your face mask, it can activate coronavirus in your body. So if you want to believe it, you know, if you were sort of seduced into those first few minutes and then you hear that, I mean, what's the human reaction? You probably then wonder, you're like, oh my, gosh, could coronavirus be activated in my body? And what will that lead you to do? It could lead you to potentially not wear a mask. I mean, there are very real world consequences to disinformation right now. And she's, maybe Brandy will have thoughts as well, but she's really become, in many ways, I think, sort of this poster child for all of the conspiracy theorists that are just so happy rallying around this whistleblower narrative, and that she's been able to unearth and expose leading scientists so that others then may reject what they recommend.
So I think we'll come back in a minute to the question of like how the media can better cover this. But, you know, I've always been struck by the university and colleges and higher education in general, you know, are kind of towers of expertise. And in a lot of instances, I have felt that universities were somewhat behind the curve on kind of competing with misinformation and disinformation. Even, you know, getting the scientists and the public health experts to outflank videos like this and other things. I'm curious, Phil, you know, in terms of your thinking about like, what is it that universities can be doing better, or what is it that they have kind of misunderstood? You know, we've seen declining trust in higher education. We've seen declining faith in the expertise of scientists that has gained tremendous ground in recent years. And I don't think any of that is disconnected from the kinds of things that you're talking about, Brandy, with hucksters and spreading misinformation and trying to kind of sow discord. So I'm just wondering, Phil, do you have any thoughts on what it is that you know, higher education has not quite well enough understood about these dynamics?
I don't know. I don't know. When I think higher education, I'm thinking research, and so I mean, there is a lot of research right now going on these topics, and you know, understanding what are the vulnerabilities of the people, like I was talking about before. What are the aspects of a message that makes it particularly attractive and interesting, and also what are the strategies and the you know, solutions or actions that we can take to counter it, and also what is the impact, the real world impact? Can we quantify? So this is the big question that a lot of academics are after, and we don't really have a good answer yet. Like, can we quantify and measure whether you know, let's say this particular pandemic viral video, how is it going to kill a certain number of people? You know, we don't have the tools to answer that question. Or is the piece of misinformation that I showed earlier about you know, satanic rituals by the Clinton campaign, did that affect the outcome of the vote in any state in 2016? Probably not, but we're not really sure. So we lack the tools to still, you know, to quantify and understand this phenomenon. But we're making a lot of progress. There's now a lot of research, and a lot of it interdisciplinary, spanning people who do, you know, analytical work and big data stuff like us, and modeling with people who, you know, reporters and journalists who understand the human aspects and the human factors, you know, psychologists who can understand cognitive social biases, and you know, run experiments in controlled situations and so on. So there's a lot of research right now. So I think we're in the right track. I am tempted to go back to something that you guys were talking about earlier about,
Sure.
Well, Nora was talking about these conspiracies, and what are the, you know, what are the ways in which they spread. And so I think that, well, Simon talked about the economy of attention, right? As it becomes, well, he predicted that as it would become cheaper to produce information, we would be overwhelmed, and the finite resource would be our attention, our finite attention. So that's, and it was incredibly insightful. And in fact, right now, the world that we live in, it's all governed by this. Like, if you're going to want to control something, affect it, influence, you go where the eyeballs are. If right now all the eyeballs are on COVID and the pandemic, then that's where I'm gonna generate. And I want to convince somebody that Jonathan eats children. I'm gonna create a narrative that you know, the pandemic is related to Jonathan eating children. and it's not difficult to do that. And people like the ones who made this video can be quite good at it. But generally speaking, that's one ingredient. You go after whatever people are paying attention to. And in a situation like the pandemic, where there is a lot of uncertainty, this happens during crisis, for example, it is particularly easy because people not knowing, having a lot of questions that are unanswered, that they have a lower guard and they are more likely to latch on to something that looks like it could be plausible. So that Nora was explicitly making all these examples there, which are great. And the other point is that you want to write your message in such a way that you're likely to elicit a response from the group that you're targeting. So for conspiracy theory, whether it is for political reasons or to sell snake oil or vitamin C, whatever, you want to go after people who are likely to be influenced by conspiracy theories. And there are so many of them right now. And because of social media, they have reached critical mass. And so there's lots of them and we know how to find them. Then we can craft a message in that way. So in the case of a pandemic, that leveraged skepticism of authorities, skepticism of science, of medical sciences, skepticism or distrust of mainstream media, and distrust of pharmaceutical industries. And so all of these things, the story writes itself in some way. Yeah, exactly. Like Brandy was saying earlier, a lot of these narratives are coming together. They're coming together because now all of the attention is on the pandemic. So if you want to sell the narrative that the sky is red, then you say the sky is red, and the reason you don't see it is because they are giving you the virus, and the virus makes you colorblind. Whatever it is, right? You can just create a narrative that connects to where the eyeballs are, whatever you're paying attention to. So a few years ago, we were the target of a misinformation campaign. And so it was on a smaller scale, of course, but it was very similar. It had these ingredients. It latched on skepticism of science and people complaining about the Obama administration overspending and science, spending for science as a way to throw away taxpayers' dollars. And so they latched on a bunch of federally funded projects, making it sounded like they were federal programs of the Obama administration to do things that were either politically biased or wasteful. In our case, we were doing research on misinformation and social bots. This was in 2014, so before everybody was talking about this. And they basically, a bunch of fringe hyper-partisan sources, later picked up by more mainstream sources like Fox News and so on, started creating this narrative that we were a secret program of the Obama administration to spy on citizens and to target conservative speech and to suppress conservative speech. And this spread virally. And we did the analysis, of course, and because the Twitter sphere is very polarized and conservative people are more likely to retweet conservative people and liberal people are more likely to retweet liberal people, this particular conspiracy was targeted at conservative people who, of course, were skeptical of science and taxes and so on. And so those people responded, and it was spreading virally in that part of the Twitter sphere. In the meanwhile, since day one, this stuff was debunked by Science magazine, by top fact checkers and so on. But that stuff was spreading on the liberal side of the Twitter sphere. And none of the people who were vulnerable and who believed those conspiracies, most of them, they were not evil. They were just thinking that it was true. There was a story that, connected them to their pre-existing beliefs and skepticism and conspiratorial thinking, but they believed that it was true. They attacked us, they sent us threats, offensive tweets, avalanches of emails to the president of the university, fires, all of that stuff. Those mostly were just victims. And they were not exposed to the correct information because they were in a completely different part. Their friends were not sharing it. The bots that were targeting were not sharing it. And so again, the structure of the information ecosystems creates a vulnerability where when you are specifically trying to push a certain narrative and manipulate people, it can help you in some sense. And anyway, so that's
so all you have to do,
yeah.
it seems that all you have to do is push it out there. I mean, Brandy, you were talking before about, can the media do a better job? And, should we even cover these things, right? Like, so like you either, by just the sheer existence of pandemic, you have to then get into, is this real or is it not? I'm reminded of the birther controversy, maybe perhaps one of the original totally nonsense made up, maybe it's not the original, but, something that gained tremendous traction, forcing Obama to, release his birth certificate. And I think that trend has continued throughout, frankly, the current presidency, which is just, I'll say something and it doesn't really matter if it's true or not, because now the media is going to have to cover it and respond to it. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, is there a proven way that the media has, are there instances in your own head of how the media or particular media outlets have responded to incidences like this well, and in particular because I'm thinking about all the ways in which universities have been subject to that, and maybe there's something they can learn there, or maybe there's a way to strategize together. Maybe, I don't know, or maybe all hope is lost.
No, I mean, I think that we know what bad coverage of this looks like from the media, right? And it's to be uncritical generally. Or to say, this is trending, here's what it said, and then offer no competing either fact check or thought to that. I'm not a fact checker, so that's not what I do. But, I work really closely with my colleague, Ben, and our way that we sort of get it is we don't try to overly debunk what the person is saying. Like, I'll cover a lot of things in which that's all we can do. But, like you said, the pandemic video was like, it reached a critical mass where we had to sort of respond to it. And the way that we did that and the way that we do everything is to look at who's behind these campaigns. And I think that we've found some success there with people who've said to us, they want to learn more about how they get these things. Like, how did I get the pandemic video? Like, who brought this to me? And so when you show people that, oh, actually, this is a coordinated, authentic, but coordinated between anti-vaccination organizations pushing a book, right? Led by R.F. Kennedy Jr. and QAnon conspiracy groups who have all proliferated online because of, frankly, Facebook's groups feature. That's something that people can sort of start to work out for themselves. And, what's always rang true to me is that people don't like to be fooled. People don't like to be tricked. And people don't like to be the victims of grifters. And so when we can shed a light on that and not focus so much on like, here's what you're seeing in frame 1, and here's why that's wrong, and here's what you're seeing in frame 2, and here's why that's not true. Like, people don't have the attention for that, but people have the appetite and the attention for a sort of yummy article on these grifters who are trying to scam you. And
Right.
If you frame it like that, at least in terms of like metrics, like there are millions of eyeballs that will read all the way down to the end of the page. And that's how we can tell that at least something's getting through to somebody.
And I'm struck also, I'm thinking about all the, even the term when we talk about, the media, I mean, there's a huge range of media that covers, and there's a lot of outlets that I think some are newer, some are themselves, I think, engage so much in false or just misinformation that it's hard to know if they should even be considered part of the media. We haven't, I don't know to what extent we've really seen the more traditional or more reliable or historically, I don't know, more prestigious news organizations really try to tackle that kind of proliferating underbelly of media that has been that has just been made possible by the internet. But increasingly, I think that it's a huge dissonance between where people get their information, whether they're getting it from these kind of lower level sources or whether they only trust, certain news pieces. And I think that's part of the issue as well. I wanted to also ask about when we're thinking about the election coming up. So that's, the next big thing. If we can ever get distracted long enough from the pandemic and pandemic to remember that we are technically in, hot election season, 4 or 5 months away. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about the kind of misinformation that you're seeing in election coverage and what we can anticipate in the lead up to November. I guess, we'll start this one with Brandy and then go around, but are we already seeing disinformation on political issues? And do you think that the misleading political content is sort of different in kind or in nature, and we should think of it as different from COVID-related disinformation?
Well, yeah, I think I think that there's a distinction between misinformation in terms of like, yes. So the short answer is yes, right? We have seen political disinformation, and that's, like you said, because, we sort of have this industry of very healthy far-right news organizations and websites and just trolls that churn out content that's meant to mislead. Joe Biden has been the subject of a lot of them, a lot of fake videos, decontextualized videos. And then also you look at something like the Lincoln Project's ad recently that got a fact check, and so there's a fine line, I think, between misinformation and disinformation, and then even political advertising, right? Which has, always sort of stretched the truth in ways that, might concern us. But I think what I'm interested in is how the term, fake news was co-opted by politicians. Like the terms misinformation and disinformation are also being co-opted by politicians now. We saw it with the Nancy Pelosi ripping up the State of the Union speech. We had Trump and all of his allies calling foul and using these terms, which like gave me a shiver down my spine because I don't want to see it co-opted in the same way fake news was, right? But those things are very different. I think even before COVID, I was looking a lot at medical misinformation in terms of the birthing movement, in terms of, treatments for autistic children and stuff like that. And I think that's compelling because the stakes are really clear. Drinking bleach to cure your autism can kill someone. Ignoring social distancing, holding up a sign in Sacramento, which they did, saying, Judy Mikovits told me not to wear a mask, so screw you. That has immediate stakes. It could kill someone. And, I think elections obviously have consequences too. They're just not as immediate. In terms of 2020, what we're looking for is we are looking for, just like the conspiracies thing where everybody chooses a coronavirus. Coronavirus will be, we assume, the prevailing narrative for 2020. There will be people saying that, efforts to change the way that we vote to deal with social distancing are all part of some fraud. We will see more narratives like that, rigging, fraud, stuff like that, all sort of related to the coronavirus. And we're also going to see, I think, narratives about who's to blame from, the Lincoln Project and others, but it's who did a good job, who did a bad job, who didn't prepare, who did prepare. And we're going to see a lot of that shifted. I assume we're going to see a lot of videos taken out of context to sort of prove the narrative that their candidate is the one who has done the best job and the opponent has done the worst job. And I just want to say one thing that I always try to highlight. I think when we think of disinformation, a lot of people think of Russia and China and Iran, and because Facebook and Twitter have taken a lot of steps to take care of accounts that have pushed a sort of state-backed narrative. But, we do a very, very good job in America of making our own disinformation campaigns. And those are the people that we're really looking to for the groups that are really going to have an impact on this election. It's the, far-right organizations making those voter fraud claims and every other claim that we're really, really looking to in terms of our media response and how we can shine a light on the most dangerous disinformation campaigns.
Well, and I think there's some international bots in there too on the disinformation side, piggybacking on one another and that kind of amplifying that you were talking about a minute ago, Phil. Nora, any thoughts on thinking about the election and COVID-19 and disinformation?
Sure. I think everything Brandy has said, I would just honestly, truly echo. It's interesting in our work, we've seen people like communities that we work with really excited and hungry for a lot of the solution-oriented tools to learn how to identify COVID-related mis and disinformation. And one of the things I worry about is, the kind of apathy that we're going to see. And I don't just mean political apathy, but I'm exhausted from all of my Zoom meetings. I bet all of you are exhausted from your Zoom meetings. I am exhausted by not just the deluge of disinformation, of course, and that I'm now verifying everything I see all the time. But I think it's just, we're going to reach a breaking point, or, a fever pitch almost, of being so overwhelmed by our online lives. And what will that mean for the election? Both, I think that we're going to continue seeing more and more efforts to weaken trust in institutions and in science, which I think can bleed over, because so much of what Brandy said in terms of coverage and what we can expect, that certainly domestic actors are at play, I agree with all of that. And so one other wrinkle in all of this is, what will the long-term consequences be of people that have been used to and worried about and thinking about, with all this time that we have at home, thinking about how our institutions are not serving a great number of us. And with that, then, what will the effect be if we do see increased state efforts to move to things like, let's say, mail-in ballots? Will people feel a sense of trust in our institutions to then accurately count ballots? I think that there are so many questions around the democratic process that kind of have this inherent trust that we bestow upon our institutions and our government. And elections are the most heightened example of our buying into that. So if we're already used to and sort of caught up in months and months and months of I want to call it a Groundhog Day, but it's just sort of the what's the newest controversy and conspiracy theory? For those that on the flip side may fall prey to those types of campaigns, what will happen if we see people writ large wanting to disassociate and disengage? I'm not quite sure, and some of what we're looking at is, how can we keep people engaged? How can we keep people interested in exercising their rights? But on the flip side, I think we're going to see so much conflated media coverage between the different issues. And I know Brandy mentioned there's a very palpable difference between COVID-related content and then political misinformation. And one of the questions then will be, how do the platforms behave, which we've really not gotten into much of. And I feel like that is its own webinar, but we're certainly going to think through, and I think we'll see new efforts, whether they are commendable or problematic, that the platforms try to think about what to do in 2020. And it's already pretty late in the game, so we'll see.
You didn't mention it, but I was also thinking, as you were talking about mail-in ballots, about, kind of also relies not just on trust in the Postal Service, but the existence of the Postal Service, which I think by the end of the year, I know that's another issue in here. We're going to turn to questions from the audience in just a minute. If any of you out there want to put some in the Q&A, I see 2 already, and we'll take them up in a second. But just before we get there, thinking then about, weakening trust in science, disengagement, I'm thinking about all the universities that have already thought about how they're going to be operating online. Do any of you have any thoughts for either universities and their leaders and what they can do in this time? Thinking about not just, there's been a lot of conversation about how universities can support, students from different backgrounds, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in terms of accessing technology and that. But I mean the kind of bigger challenges that we're seeing right now around, misinformation, disinformation. Do you have any thoughts on the faculty member whose students, are now going to be engaging with them online, all the way up to the university president, about what can be done or what needs to be done? And I'm going to start with you, Phil. Any thoughts?
Well, where to start? Lots of stuff, but certainly, I think as we head into the elections, and and I also completely agree with what Brandy and Nora have said, these themes are going to merge, and the elections are going to be about the pandemic and vice versa. And part of these narratives will probably be aimed at voter suppression. We've seen this a lot in recent elections, and we've also seen you know, in inauthentic accounts. That's a lot of our research is about social bots and manipulation and coordinated campaigns and how you detect them online and so on and so forth. And we see that a lot of those things are aimed at voter suppression. So in some sense, if you can just convince people that it's all the same, right and left, or they're just equally bad, well, that's part of your job is done. If you can get a lot of people to stay home, that's one way to control the outcome. And the pandemic can be part of that because it's a complex issue and people are going to be overwhelmed, and it's easy to push those narratives. So perhaps what universities can do is help educate students about their own vulnerabilities and their own role, both as passive consumers of information and as producers and spreaders of information. So, you know, I earlier mentioned our Fakey app, which is about you know, news literacy. It helps people become aware of how they can be vulnerable because they see something on their Facebook feed or Twitter feed, and it makes you angry, or it makes you anxious, or it makes you afraid, and that creates the pressure to share it with your friends. And so people becoming aware that they're being victimized when they do that, recognize the feeling of, oh, I need to share this, and recognize that that's the moment where you are being possibly tricked. And so recognize that their own emotional responses are part of what makes them victims, and also recognize the consequence that can have by looking at how much they participate in amplifying a piece of misinformation and exposing their friends to it. The other one is helping people become aware of their own vulnerabilities because of their political engagement. You know, on one side, we want people to be engaged. On the other side, if you're very engaged and you're online, you are very likely to be biased and be vulnerable. Most research so far has shown that conservative people have been more vulnerable. They have been targeted more with misinformation, and they have reshared more misinformation by a lot. There is pretty solid literature on that, and we and other researchers all find it consistently true. However, our research is showing that although the volume is bigger on the conservative side, the trend is symmetric, both as you move both to the extreme conservative partisanship as well as extreme liberal partisanship. You see that vulnerability increases in the same way. People are more likely to reshare low credibility information, both if you're in conservative echo chambers and if they're in liberal echo chambers. And we now observe that unscrupulous people on the left as well as on the right are creating tricks, for example, on Twitter, with social bots, with coordination, with apps that create, you know, for astroturfing basically, where people can donate the credentials of their accounts and let a campaign tweet on their behalf to create the appearance that you have a social movement or you know, a grassroots campaign, where in fact it's just a single entity that is controlling the message. And that is happening on the left as well as on the right, increasingly. So making people aware of their own political engagement and alignment as also contribute to their own vulnerability. Sure, I think I'm smart because I'm liberal and I'm not going to fall for a crazy conspiracy on the right. But you know what? I am just as vulnerable to a crazy conspiracy on the left, right? And so people are aware that they think that they're less vulnerable than they are because they recognize the things that they know are fake, but they are not aware of the things that they don't recognize. And then finally, the fact that we're all vulnerable because online, you're not really sure who you're talking to and how the information that ends up on your feed ends up on your feed. So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help people appreciate the kind of bias that you are in by virtue of accessing information that is mediated both by algorithms that you don't understand by the platform, and also by the influence of your area of the social network that you're in. So we have some research now that is showing that even accounts that do completely random things online as they shift to the right or they shift to the left, they're more likely to be exposed to and to produce low credibility information just by virtue of basically
Just by
floating,
being there.
just by being there. So you don't have to assume that, because a lot of misinformation is shared by conservatives, that means that they are vulnerable, they're stupid, they're gullible. No, 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 no. They're simply in an area where there is a lot of activity on Twitter. If you find yourself in another area that is similar, wherever it is, right or left, you're going to be equally vulnerable. So I think those are some of the things that we need to understand and perhaps help people appreciate in terms of their vulnerabilities.
Brandy, Nora, anything to add here in thinking about, what higher education can do?
I just want to say that I think that's so smart. I talked to Kate Starbird a couple of weeks back, and we talked about some of her research where she talked to people who had shared misinformation around the Boston bombing and fingered people incorrectly, et cetera. And, when she went back to talk to them, they sort of had an aha moment where it was like, I'm going to be more careful in the future. I had an aha moment with the Covington Catholic event where the boy was looking at the Native American drummer, and I was so mad. And I think of that moment all the time, because whatever you think of that moment, we did not have all of the facts about what was happening. You could see a tiny snippet, and I was so willing to make a judgment right at that moment that for me was my aha moment. Like, how do you create an aha moment for everyone in the country, for everyone in the world, where everyone does think more seriously about the repercussions of this moment, of what they're about to share? And I think that from people that I've talked to, they're finding COVID might be an opportunity in a weird way, that people might actually stop and say, wait, if I share this, might someone actually do that? Like, who might this hurt? Who might this, harm? Who might this affect in my community? How might this spread a deadly virus in my own neighborhood? And I think that's sort of the opportunity and the challenge as I see it. But I also think that if anybody can do it, it's universities, right? Where the whole point is to challenge your biases and go in and learn from people who are different than you. I really thought that was smart. Anyway.
Nora.
I'm sensitive to time, so I'm thinking about what would my top 2 recommendations be for higher ed officials and people on campuses, which is, I like to try to challenge myself. I'm like, what can we do in 1 minute? Because I think everything everyone has said is spot on. I think one is university administrators and leaders should commit to transparent conveyance of information to the entire campus community. I think that right now, as we are seeing less and less transparency across the board from our governments, whether they're local all the way up to federal, it sort of helps contribute to the tone of distrust. So I would say absolutely commit to transparent, not opaque communication of things happening on campuses. And then my typical soapbox comment is really regarding the pause. It's sort of almost what Brandy said, but a little bit different on the aha moment, is the pausing before you share something. If you are online, Facebook is not a news source. That is number one. It is a gateway for us. So if you see something you want to share, think about why you want to share it. If you can even challenge yourself, everyone, all of us, to pause and think about, do I really want to share this? Which is sort of what Brandy said, will this cause harm? My aha moment, well, I've had many, but the most recent COVID one I always admit to people is about the swans in the Venice Canal, because I totally fell prey to that. And I remember saying to myself, I have to share this. I'm so excited that climate change is finally seeing a brief, sort of respite from all of the human degradation of this planet. I mean, I was going wild. It was like a Saturday morning. And I thought to myself, this is too good to be true. And usually if it's too good to be true, it is. And I would say absolutely pause. Early research is showing that when people are prompted online to pause for a moment, if there's a kind of friction for them or a nudge, that actually it helps minimize the spread of misinformation. Platforms are also beginning to think through what they're going to do, how they're going to convey that kind of notification or invitation for users to pause before they share. And I would say if you can pause, great. if you want to up the ante a little bit, not only pause, but then fact check the thing you want to share. Because a lot of the time it's not actually verified or credible. So I'll end there.
Thanks, and thank you all. I think these are all important things to consider about, how universities can be engines of improved education and awareness along some of these issues, and what they can do themselves, committing to transparency and promoting, best practices or good digital consumer practices. I want to just turn really quickly to these two questions that we have in the Q&A and see, we didn't really get into this first issue very much, but it's essentially this question of oversight. The U.S. government has a certain level of moral authority to make decisions on free expression because of the checks and balances that have historically been set up. But as we increasingly move our speech from public squares to publicly traded companies, how do we adjust? Does Facebook's oversight board have the needed moral authority to make these important decisions, or do we need a quasi-government body to help regulate social media? And I know, Nora, you've had a lot of thought on this, so I'm going to come back to you first on this one.
Oh no. I knew you would. Well, so let's see. I know who asked this question too. So hi, David. Let's see. It's interesting. Facebook has long said they don't want to be and are not the arbiters of truth, right? That they are not simply, they should not be tasked with conveying to communities and to users what is real, what is credible, and what isn't. And yet creating the oversight board, I think in many ways has put them in a posture that acts or is beginning to create structures akin to democratic governments. It's setting up a review process, much like our legal courts. And, as a lawyer as well, I've been very curious to see how this will play out. I think that, the US government is finally, though slowly, beginning to think through how do we consider altering Section 230, which, without getting too far down that path, is essentially thinking through how liable platforms should or can be to the content that is shared on the platforms. And in beginning to have those conversations, I think the US government, at least, is really doing its job in beginning to think through those implications. What I will say in a larger sense, though, because a lot of audiences may not know about it, is the ways that laws are very dangerously now being introduced around the world to criminalize disinformation, which at first blush, I think can sound really intuitively great. Laws that are introduced in Singapore and all over the world to essentially monitor and then criminalize people who are purveyors of false and misleading content. The problem, though, is that, and PEN America's sort of begun looking at this issue, is that so much of what we see is the way those laws and statutes are used not really to target bad actors, but to target mainly journalists, dissidents, activists, anyone who is trying to shed light on things that perhaps governments do not want exposed. And so in the middle of all of this, I'm not sure I really have a conclusion for us, like what will quasi-government bodies do, and should they have the sort of moral high ground above where governments are acting. But I do think that there has been a sort of effort right now to think through what are regulatory solutions. The problem is that we must be sensitive to the free expression implications, so that what we don't do is silence certain groups, that we don't censor speech online, that we're not targeting, the brandies of the world.
And I think it raises, you're raising interesting points also about just, we were talking about before, the history of the term fake news. And, it's all in the eye, it's often these terms are in the eye of whoever's using them to determine, what's fake news and what's not. Our closing question then comes from Stephen First here. It's, if low quality information spreads better than high quality information when there is high levels of information and low attention time, is this an argument against new modes of informational transfer, essentially an argument against social media in favor of traditional models? And I know, Phil, you've built a lot of research on social media. So is the conclusion for you after, I don't know if it's a lifetime yet of work, but is the conclusion, this is a failed experiment? And I really just want to say, I remember very distinctly when the internet was the savior of the world, going to usher in, this new global civil society. And if it wasn't going to do that, gee, at least it was, going to be a great deal of fun. And now it's very dark. What we think of when we think of the internet is concerning. It's become more of a concern than perhaps a kind of force for liberation in the way that it was once conceived. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts in response to that.
Yeah, so first of all, we say this of every technology. Every technology is both good and bad. Initially, we learn how good it is, and then eventually we learn how it can also be abused. People had huge concerns about printed press and then TV and radio and whatever, right? So these concerns have been with us before, even as recently as email, right? There was a point where we thought, oh, we cannot use email because of spam. And eventually we tend to find technological solutions often, a mix of technological and policy solutions that mitigate the dark sides and hopefully retain most of the positive sides of the technology. So I'm somewhat optimistic in thinking that this will be the same for the web, the internet, and social media. We were naive earlier, and we don't need to be overly pessimistic now. Let's remember that these things have existed only for 10 or 15 years, and it's still incredibly early. Technology evolves super fast, but our policies and laws and norms do not evolve that fast. So we're still adjusting. Even if you look at the ways that platforms themselves are responding, it seems like every 3 months, Facebook, or even more often, Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube put up new policies or modify their policies. And so even though they try to make it look like they're quite consistent with this, we're not the arbiter of the truth, like Nora was saying, in practice, what they do changes enormously. They go from not taking down anything to taking down things very aggressively, to only taking down things from certain people, to tweaking their algorithms, to using fact checkers in the case of Facebook and suppressing stuff, to completely allowing any advertising, to completely disallowing all political advertisements, right? So these things are different across platforms. They're changing fast, and even though the legal framework has not even began to respond to these issues, except in very naive and weird ways, like Nora was saying, in some other countries. Despite that, the platforms are really trying to figure out what to do. And an example, connecting this question to the previous question, right? Look at the fact that most platforms feel strongly that they don't want to be accused of censorship towards political speech. And so politicians could say pretty much anything, even blatantly false and so on. But then they also now have policies about taking down stuff that is dangerous to the health. And now these two things clash. And so now they have to update their policies, where either they need to allow dangerous information to stay up, or they have to take down information from politicians. And they are trying to find their balance. Recently, they took down some misinformation that had been retweeted by Trump. And then because Trump had retweeted it, not misinformation, sorry, the information that was against the terms of service in outing whistleblower. If you remember that, it seems like eons ago, right? It was just a few weeks ago. And then because Trump had retweeted it, then they reinstated it because they didn't want to be seen as censoring the president. And so now this is happening more and more. They're taking down content by politicians if it is in violation of the health spread, because they feel like public opinion is more friendly to taking down information that may be dangerous to public health. So these things are really evolving, and we're still figuring it out. And technology, will help solve some of these issues. And the genie is out of the bottle. We're not going to go back to the traditional newspapers. I think it's a waste of time to even think about that. What we need to do is to think how to improve these technologies. And So there's lots and lots and lots of things that people are working on. Going to the pausing that Nora was talking about, right now, for example, one of the vulnerabilities that we're studying to automation and coordination is because you can use software to generate a lot of content. And so Twitter in the past decreased the number of tweets that you can post every day automatically. They decreased it to thousands. Okay, so you can still post thousands of messages per day, and that's fine, right? Obviously, you can't do that, manually, so you have to write software for that. So eventually, maybe they'll lower it further, and we'll tweak these rules to make sure that the platform is being used in a more responsible way by real humans, and you kind of have a little bit of more of a sense of who's posting something. And so I'm a big advocate of this idea of friction, whether it's imposing a pause to make sure that people don't react based on their emotional response, but they think about what they're doing. And also friction in terms not only of the content, but also friction in terms of the social connections that we establish. Right now, it's so easy to manipulate the space by fake accounts that create these dense, facilitate the formation of these dense echo chambers. And our own biases make it very easy to unfollow people that we disagree with and follow people that we agree with. But that's actually a vulnerability that decreases the diversity of opinion to which we are exposed. So we could even put friction in terms of the number of connections that we can meaningfully maintain, so that I'm forced to think, oh, do I really want to follow this other account if it needs that I have to unfollow somebody else that I know and trust. So there will be probably mechanisms over time that will be developed either because of necessity for legal reasons or just because the platforms are interested in self-preservation. But I'm optimistic that even with now, as we're becoming more aware of all these dangers, hopefully we'll be able to mitigate the worst aspect of it.
Well, I think it's just been so interesting to learn about all of these things. We are just about out of time. I do want to just, Brandy, ask if you have a final comment, a 30-second, anything to add here on either of these last two questions, just in closing.
Yeah, I guess so. And it's just to say that Facebook is a bajillion-dollar company who cares about growth. Like, despite Zuckerberg's revisionist history of his starting and free speech and all of that, like, this is a company, and the bottom line is, if users are rising up in mass and saying, we don't want to see this junk on our feed anymore, or that I don't want to host my great rock club on the same platform where white supremacists and conspiracy theorists that think that, there is a satanic cabal to take down the president are also hosted. And so I'm out. Like, if that happens, that's what the company will respond to. They're not going to respond. They'll play whack-a-mole with me as a journalist or with academics, but that's the only thing that's going to move it. And so it all does, at the end of the day, go back to the consumer.
All right. Very interesting points. Yeah, I think, there was this moment where a lot of teachers had to figure out how to deal with Wikipedia. Could it be trusted? Could students use it? Was it real? And then there was, all these questions about the internet. And I think, if anything, that has all gotten a great deal more complicated for professors across the board and for universities as a whole, as they reckon with, what the internet has become. And then that was just before, we were all living at home and trying to imagine teaching online. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation full of really important and insightful bits of advice for higher education, for administrators and faculty to think about. I know those out there are joining me in applauding all three of you for this great conversation, and I just want to thank you all one more time. For our audience members, if you aren't followers of PEN America, please do subscribe to our channels and check out some of our advice online, our media literacy program that Nora, my colleague here, runs, and our online campus free speech guide, which can be found at campusfreespeech.penn.org. Thanks all again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.